Tell me, where do you usually watch my videos? At home, work, or somewhere else?
You know, I was like, no. There's a specific kind of silence that wraps itself around you like a wet wool blanket. When you realize, not think, not suspect, but finally know that the people who raised you, who called you their everything, who tucked you in at night and told you that family comes first, they never really saw you at all. I remember standing in the hallway that morning, clutching a cold mug of coffee I'd reheated twice, but never drank, and watching my mom laughing at something Evan said as he wheeled out his new titanium luggage, the one with the charger built in and a hidden passport pocket, the one I didn't even know existed until that moment. She touched his arm like it was made of gold and said, "You're going to love the view from the Eiffel Tower." And he winked at her, already dressed in his travel blazer, like he was heading to a business meeting instead of a birthday trip. My birthday had passed 2 months earlier. I got a maybe next year text and a $25 Amazon gift card that still sat untouched in my inbox. That wasn't even the part that broke me. Not really. What broke me came 2 hours later, after the car service took them away, when I went into the guest bathroom and saw they'd taken Evan's monogrammed toiletries bag from the cabinet, the one Mom kept in there for when her baby boy came to visit. Mine was under the sink, next to the backup toilet paper, covered in dust and half-empty travel-sized toothpaste tubes. I just stood there, staring at it like it might suddenly tell me why the hell I always ended up the forgotten one in a family of 3 people. When I was 8, Evan got a party with a magician and a pony. When I turned 8, I got an ice cream cake from the store and a promise that we'd make it up next year. They never did. I told myself for years that it was okay, that I was the mature one, the independent one, the one who didn't need the attention. But standing there that morning, at 34 years old, in a house filled with smiles I wasn't part of, that lie finally stopped holding up. What kind of parents look you in the eye and tell you they can't afford a vacation, then 2 months later, book a luxury trip to Paris for your younger brother's birthday and fly first class like it's no big deal? I kept thinking about that damn group chat they made for trip logistics, which I wasn't even added to, like I wasn't part of this family unless they needed help watching the dog or organizing Mom's pills. I thought about the time I drove Dad to the ER when his blood pressure tanked, sat with him for 6 hours while Mom was unreachable at book club, and the only thing he remembered later was how nice the nurse had been. I thought about all the invisible times, the quiet loyalty I gave, the birthday texts I never missed, the Christmas shopping I did for both of them because Evan was too busy with work. That morning, something snapped, and it didn't feel like anger. Not in the hot, screaming way people imagine when you say you're mad. No, this was colder. It was clarity. A switch flipped. I poured the cold coffee into the sink, grabbed my laptop, and opened a blank document. I typed 4 words in a bold black font. They looked like a scream frozen in place. "Enjoy your memories. I'm done being one." I printed it, placed it on my perfectly made bed, and sat for a long while just staring at it, letting the weight of that sentence settle into the air around me. Then I opened the closet and started pulling down boxes. People don't realize how little you actually need when you decide to disappear. My plan wasn't dramatic. I wasn't going to fake my death or run off to another country. I just didn't want to be part of their narrative anymore. I wanted to write my own, one where I wasn't the side character in Evan's Golden Boy movie. I texted Tasha, my best friend since high school, the only person who ever asked how I really was. She responded immediately with a thumbs up and the address of a spare room she had been renting out since her divorce. I packed 2 duffel bags, clothes, laptop, personal papers, and then I did something that felt petty and glorious. I opened the family photo album stored in the hallway closet and took out every picture I was in. Not violently, no tearing, no fire. I just slipped them out like surgical removals. If I wasn't part of the family in real life, then I damn well wouldn't be in the illusion of it either. 2 hours later, I left my key on the counter, placed the note squarely in the center of the bed, and walked out the front door without looking back. The house smelled like linen and lemon cleaner and lies. Outside, the sky was an ugly, overcast gray, but it felt like the first time I could breathe without asking permission. In that moment, I knew I wasn't running away. I was withdrawing consent. I was done being the quiet background character to their big, bright vacation life. Let them come back with their souvenirs and smiles. Let them laugh and tell stories over wine and croissants. When they walked into that house and saw my room stripped bare, and that note sitting on the bed like a gravestone, I wanted them to feel it, not just notice it. Feel the weight of what they'd ignored for 34 years. I know what you're thinking. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should have talked it out, had a family meeting, expressed my feelings. But let me ask you something. If your parents looked you in the eye and left you behind with a text while they flew first class with your sibling to the city of love, would you stay quiet? Or would you finally, after decades of being invisible, do something they'd never forget? Because I'll tell you this, silence can be a scream too. It just echoes longer. It's a strange thing, the way memory works. How it doesn't come back in full moments or perfect scenes, but rather in fragments that hit you when you least expect them, like stepping barefoot on a tack in the dark. That night, after I left the house, I stayed in Tasha's spare room, which smelled faintly of lavender and unopened windows, and I lay on a mattress that was a little too firm, staring at the ceiling with my fingers locked over my stomach. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel all of it. Not just the fresh wound of being left behind, but the long, slow infection of years and years of subtle betrayals that no one ever calls abuse, because it doesn't leave bruises, only echoes. I remembered Christmas when I was 12. Evan got the remote-controlled car he wanted, the one with suspension and lights and rubber wheels that could climb over everything. And I got a sweater 2 sizes too big, with the tag still on, and a "we'll return it together, sweetie," that never happened. I remembered high school graduation when I stood there in my cap and gown, beaming at the crowd from the football field, while my parents clapped politely and left early to beat the traffic. But 4 years later, when Evan graduated, they rented a damn party tent and handed out custom cupcakes with his college logo on top. I remembered how every time he failed, and God knows he did, from dropping out of pre-med to crashing his first car, they called it a phase, a learning opportunity, a bump in the road. But when I, God forbid, missed a flight or got a C in calculus, it was always, "We expected more from you, Melissa. You're the responsible one." They weaponized my reliability, turned my steadiness into a reason not to look at me, not to celebrate me, not to see me at all. Tasha listened to all of this without interrupting, sitting cross-legged at the edge of the bed, sipping red wine from a chipped mug that said, "Best dog, Mom," nodding like someone who had heard versions of this story from more women than she could count. Sisters, daughters, ex-wives. She didn't try to fix it, which I appreciated more than I could say. She didn't suggest therapy or giving them a chance. She just looked at me and said, "So what's the next move?" And something about that question, not why, not how could they, but what now, flipped a switch in me again. This time, not the icy clarity of the morning, but something sharper, more deliberate. Because I wasn't looking to disappear into sadness. I wanted them to feel the gap. I wanted to hollow out the space I had occupied and let it echo in their ears like a reminder they couldn't shake off. The first thing I did was delete myself from their digital lives. I logged into the shared family cloud and erased every file that had my face in it. Photos from birthdays, beach trips, graduations, selfies we took at the zoo that one decent year. I didn't rage delete, didn't wipe the whole thing. No, that would have been too obvious. I surgically removed myself, like editing out a background prop no one notices until it's gone. Then I went to my social media, which wasn't much. Just a quiet Instagram and a semi-dead Facebook. And I unfriended them, blocked them, cleaned house like I was vacuuming after a bad breakup. I wasn't afraid of what they'd say. I just didn't want them watching me from behind digital windows like I was some strange neighbor they used to know. The next part came later that week. After Tasha helped me carry my boxes from her car, into a small one-bedroom rental just outside of the city, a place with old carpet and creaky doors and a kitchen the size of a hallway. But to me, it felt like sovereignty. I unpacked in silence, placed my 3 framed photos on a secondhand bookshelf, and for the first time since I was a kid, I didn't feel like I had to make myself smaller just to fit. And then, once everything was set, I pulled out a small cardboard box from the bottom of my suitcase, the one with all the little keepsakes you forget you kept. My birthstone necklace from Grandma, a Polaroid of me at age 7 in the backyard wearing a crown made of tinfoil and dandelions, a letter my mom had written me when I turned 18 that said, "We're so proud of the woman you're becoming." That letter made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because of how hollow it felt now, how many years I had spent chasing the approval it pretended to represent. And that's when the idea hit me. I wouldn't just erase myself. I'd return their love in kind, not with rage, not with fire, but with cold, calculated detachment. I started gathering the little souvenirs they'd given me over the years. The Eiffel Tower keychain from a business trip Dad took 10 years ago, the ceramic cat Mom picked up at some flea market, the snow globe Evan brought back from Chicago. And I packed them each in a box, neatly, one per envelope, with no note, just objects. As if to say, here's what you gave me, I'm giving it back. Every week, they'd get one in the mail. No return address, no message. Just the weight of their own selective affection dropped back into their laps like stones into a still pond. I didn't want to hurt them physically. I just wanted them to live in that awkward pause, the moment of confusion before the denial kicks in, the itch under the skin when something isn't quite right. I wanted them to start noticing the empty chair at dinner, the quiet on group texts, the way Evan smiled in photos while my absence made the image feel off-kilter. Because sometimes revenge isn't about fire or fury. Sometimes it's about letting people stew in the silence they helped create, giving them all the time in the world to wonder, not just where you went, but why it took you this long to finally leave. And when they asked themselves those questions, I wanted the answer to come not in words, but in memories. Not mine, theirs. The ones they'd built without me, the ones I was never really part of, even when I was standing right there. The morning they returned from Paris, the house was still in perfect order, the beds made, the floors swept, the refrigerator humming with the same dull persistence as always. And yet, for the first time in years, that house was carrying a silence that didn't feel like the usual peaceful quiet of an empty home. It was the absence of something once taken for granted, the kind of hollow stillness that creeps into your bones when you realize the shadow you thought was behind you is actually gone. I wasn't there to see their faces, obviously, but I could imagine it clearly, my mom pushing the door open with her suitcase wheels thunking over the threshold, my dad coming in behind her, already grumbling about jet lag, Evan carrying some ridiculous duty-free shopping bag with cologne and overpriced chocolate, everyone glowing from the adventure, laughing about security lines and mispronounced menus, and that one time Dad almost ordered snails thinking they were mushrooms. All of it wrapped in the smug satisfaction of a family trip well done. They probably expected me to be there, maybe sulking in the kitchen, maybe pretending not to care, maybe saying looks fun through gritted teeth while they passed out souvenirs like we were all part of the same story. But instead, they were met with a kind of vacancy that couldn't be explained away as she must be at work or maybe she went out for groceries. Because it wasn't just my absence that made the place feel foreign. It was the surgical precision with which I'd remove myself. No laundry in the hamper, no coffee mug in the sink, no shoes by the front door. My presence wasn't just missing, it had been retracted, as if I'd never lived there at all. And then they would have walked into my room, or what used to be my room, and found the bed stripped of anything soft or personal, the desk bare, the bookshelf empty except for that single printed note, lying dead center on the mattress like a gravestone. Enjoy your memories. I'm done being one. I knew my mom would cry first. Not out of guilt, but out of confusion. The kind of emotional response you give when reality doesn't align with your version of events. when someone else's pain finally refuses to play by your rules. My dad would have gone quiet, doing that thing he does where he tightens his jaw and stares off like he's trying to recall whether this was all some misunderstanding, and Evan, God, Evan, would probably just blink and say something useless like, "She's being dramatic." Because in his world, I was always the one who overreacted, who misunderstood, who couldn't just let it go. It wasn't long after that moment that the texts started coming. First from Mom, soft and sweet and filled with feigned worry. "Honey, where are you? Please talk to us. We're worried." Then from Dad, colder and clipped. "This isn't funny, Melissa. Come home so we can talk." And finally, Evan chiming in with that infuriating tone of brotherly detachment. "Whatever this is, it's not helping anyone." I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I let the silence do the talking, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to explain my absence to people who never questioned why I was always the one left behind. But they didn't give up. They tried calling Tasha, even though she hadn't spoken to them in years. Not since high school, when my mom made a snide comment about her influence after we went to a concert without telling anyone. Tasha didn't answer the first call, but on the second, after 3 glasses of wine and a long day at work, she finally picked up, leaned back in her creaky kitchen chair, and told my mother in the calmest voice she could muster, "Melissa is safe. She's not coming back. And if you really want to know why, maybe take a good look at how you treat your children. Or more specifically, how you treat your daughter like a spare part." Then she hung up and blocked the number. No fireworks, no screaming, just truth, dropped like a stone in still water. Later that night, I sat on the small balcony of my apartment, the one that overlooked a parking lot and a dying tree, and I held the phone in my hand, not to answer them, but to listen to the voicemails they kept leaving. They ranged from pleading to furious, spinning from concern to guilt to disbelief. And all I could think about as I listened to Mom say for the 3rd time, "We didn't know you felt this way," was how absurd it was that I had to vanish entirely before they even considered asking how I felt. All those years of showing up, cleaning up, holding back, keeping the peace, all of it invisible, until I finally stopped doing it. And while they unraveled in that house, surrounded by souvenirs and framed photos with my face missing, I was building something. Not revenge, not exactly, but a kind of reckoning. Every day that passed, I grew quieter, more focused, more resolved. I didn't want their apologies, not if they were just reactions to my absence. I wanted the space to rebuild my life in a place where I wasn't the family disappointment or the backup plan, or the emotional mule carrying everyone's expectations. Still, in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't over, not yet. Because people like my parents, people who build their lives around the illusion of a perfect family, they don't take silence lightly. They treat it like a stain that has to be scrubbed away, a threat to the image they've spent decades curating. And I was about to find out just how far they'd go to keep that illusion intact. There comes a point somewhere between packing up your life and watching the first dented souvenir box arrive at their front door, when you realize that disappearing isn't just an act of escape. It's a strategy, one built not on rage or retaliation, but on clarity sharpened by years of dismissal so routine, it became the wallpaper of your existence. By the time I moved into the 1-bedroom walk-up with peeling paint on the windowsills and a heat unit that wheezed like an asthmatic cat, I wasn't mourning the loss of my family. I was finally coming to terms with the fact that they were never really mine, in the way I had tried to believe for 3.5 decades. The clean break wasn't clean because it lacked emotion. It was clean because I'd already bled everything dry trying to make them notice me when it mattered. And now I was finally done handing out tourniquets for wounds they refused to admit they'd caused. The apartment was small but serviceable, perched on the edge of a sleepy neighborhood that smelled like gasoline and fried onions after dark, where the neighbors nodded politely but never asked questions. And for the first time in years, I could come home without feeling like I was shrinking into a role someone else had written for me. I bought a new bed frame from a thrift store, dragged it up the stairs myself, and assembled it on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while listening to old jazz records and thinking about nothing. No one called to ask how the move went. No one offered to help. But for once, the silence didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like proof that I was finally out from under the microscope of their selective concern. That week, I sent the second souvenir, a chipped ceramic cat from a flea market in Ohio that my mom had once given me as a reminder to always land on your feet, which had felt sweet at the time, but now reeked of the kind of passive-aggressive wisdom people hand out when they don't want to take responsibility for why you were falling in the first place. I packed it carefully, no note, just tissue paper and tape, and I imagined the look on her face when she opened it. Confused at first, then troubled. The kind of slow realization that eats away at someone who's been ignoring the warning signs long enough to think they were imaginary. The calls kept coming, though less frequently now. Voicemail after voicemail, filled with rehearsed compassion, with subtle manipulations baked into every sentence like poison in a pretty cake. "We just want to talk, Melissa. We never meant to hurt you. We don't understand what's happening." That was always the line that stuck in my throat. We don't understand. Because of course they didn't. They'd never had to. Understanding required noticing, and noticing required effort. And for as long as I can remember, I was the one doing all the emotional lifting in that family, while they floated along in their obliviousness, praising Evan's every mediocre accomplishment while treating my steady contributions as part of the background noise. And then one evening, a birthday card arrived. Not a text, not an email, not a desperate phone call, but a physical card, hand-addressed, with my name in my mother's careful cursive. I let it sit on the kitchen counter for 3 days, unopened, like a bomb waiting to go off, until the curiosity twisted into irritation and I finally tore it open. Inside was a bland Hallmark message about how birthdays are a time for reflection and love, followed by my mother's note in blue ink that read, "We miss you terribly. We hope you'll come home soon. Paris wasn't the same without you." And taped to the inside of the card, as if it were a peace offering, was a snow globe of the Eiffel Tower, the kind you buy at a gift shop for $10, the kind tourists bring home when they can't be bothered to really think about what someone might want. I stared at it for a long time, the tiny flakes of fake snow suspended in fluid around that cold silver tower, and then I dropped it in the trash without a word. Tasha came by later that night with takeout and cheap wine, and when I told her about the snow globe, she didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, took a long sip from her glass, and said, "That's not a gift, that's bait." And she was right. That snow globe wasn't about me. It was about them, about their guilt, their narrative, their desire to tie a neat little bow on something they'd never actually tried to understand. Because if I came back now, if I softened, it would let them off the hook. It would become a story they could tell at Thanksgiving about the time Melissa got upset but came around once she cooled off. But I wasn't interested in being the punchline of their emotional cover-up. So I made another decision. Not dramatic, not loud, just permanent. I went to the DMV, changed my last name to something simple and clean, no hyphens, no trace of the Grant legacy. I updated my bank, my lease, my LinkedIn, my email signature. I began erasing the paper trail that led back to the person they used to overlook, one document at a time. It was liberating in a way that felt almost spiritual, not because I hated them, but because I no longer needed them to see me in order to feel like I existed. By the time the 5th souvenir box had been delivered, a novelty Paris spoon my father once gave me with a shrug, saying, "Found it in the airport, thought you might like it," the calls had stopped. The silence had returned. But this time, it wasn't mine. It belonged to them. And I hoped it echoed in every corner of that too-quiet house, the same way I used to echo behind Evan's applause, behind their smiles, behind every trip and celebration and warm family memory they never thought to include me in. Because the thing about cutting off clean is that it doesn't mean you forget. It means you finally stop trying to be remembered by people who were never listening in the first place. There is a moment, subtle and unannounced, When pain transforms from something that demands attention into something that merely exists. Like old wallpaper you no longer notice, or a scar you trace out of habit rather than agony. And in that quiet transformation, something inside you finally hardens into permanence. It didn't happen the day I left, and it didn't happen the night I dropped the Eiffel Tower snow globe into the trash without ceremony. No, it happened sometime later, on an ordinary Tuesday, in the middle of doing something insignificant. Washing dishes, I think. When I realized I no longer felt the need to look over my shoulder to see if they'd reached out again, because even if they had, it no longer mattered. That absence of craving, the hollow where their approval used to live, didn't ache anymore. It just existed, like a room you stopped entering years ago. I had built a new rhythm, one that didn't include the endless emotional labor of trying to matter to people who always acted surprised when I reminded them I existed. I had a job that didn't demand I smile when I didn't feel like it. I had neighbors who didn't know my last name, but always held the door open. I had Tasha, who never asked me to explain the parts of myself that came from being neglected, who never made me feel like a burden for needing space, silence, or even just a little acknowledgement that sometimes survival feels like a victory parade no one shows up for. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, I had mornings that didn't start with a lump in my throat and nights that didn't end with me rehearsing arguments I'd never be brave enough to have. But that doesn't mean the ghosts vanished. You don't untangle yourself from family so much as you learn how to live with the knots they left behind. And some nights, especially the ones when the wind rattled the old windows, or when the smell of some meal drifted in from the neighbor's unit and reminded me of holidays past. The memories would rise up like weeds after rain, not the obvious ones, like birthdays or Christmases, but the smaller, more corrosive moments. Sitting alone at Evan's piano recital, knowing they'd forgotten to save me a seat, overhearing my mother on the phone telling her sister, "Melissa's just more practical, not the sentimental type." Watching my father beam with pride as Evan gave his toast at someone else's wedding, while I stood at the edge of the crowd, holding their coats like the damn coat rack I'd become in every chapter of our lives. It was on one of those nights, in that quiet unease, that I opened my laptop and began recording a message. Not for closure, not as some dramatic confrontation, but as an offering of truth. Because if there was anything left between me and them, it deserved the dignity of being spoken in my voice. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just spoke plainly, one sentence folding into the next, explaining how it feels to be the one left behind not by accident, but by design. How I spent years waiting for the moment they'd finally look at me and say, "We see you, we're sorry," and how that moment never came. Not even after I walked out the door and left a hole big enough to echo in. I scheduled the message to send on Evan's next birthday. A calculated decision, not because I wanted to ruin his day, but because I wanted him to know, at least once in his life, what it felt like to have his celebration punctured by something he couldn't ignore. Not cruelty, just consequence. And in that message, I told him the one thing I never had the courage to say out loud. That it wasn't his fault, not really, but it was his silence that hurt me most. Because he could have spoken up. He could have said, "Hey, what about Melissa?" He could have noticed, but he never did. And now he would live with that knowledge, however briefly or deeply it struck him. I didn't wait around to see the aftermath. I had no interest in hearing their reactions or dissecting their responses. I didn't want apologies laced with conditions or attempts at rebuilding bridges I no longer had any desire to cross. Instead, I walked down to the little corner cafe where no one knew my name, ordered a black coffee and a croissant, and sat at the window as the city moved around me. Loud, chaotic, indifferent. It felt honest. It felt like life without performance, but just when I thought the story had folded itself shut, when I had placed the final stone on the grave of that version of me who kept asking to be loved louder, I received a reply. A short, simple email from Evan, sent the evening of his birthday, with no subject line and no signature. It contained just 3 words. "I finally understand." That was it. No follow-up, no excuses, no plea for reconciliation. And for a moment, just a brief flicker of heart and breath, I felt something stir. Not forgiveness, not hope, just a recognition that he had heard me, really heard me, for the first time in his life. But as I stared at those words, fingers hovering above the keyboard, I realized I had nothing left to say. Not out of spite or apathy, but because that chapter was already closed, its pages filled with a pain I no longer had the appetite to reread. So I closed the laptop, slid it under the couch, and let the silence settle once again. Not as punishment, but as peace. I didn't know what would happen next, whether they'd call, write, show up, or fade away completely. And for once it didn't matter, because this wasn't a story about them anymore. It was mine. And in the end, it was never about being understood by them. It was about finally, fully, irrevocably understanding myself. And that was enough.